Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We are in the third part of a three-part series here with our special guest, Dr. Beatrice Chestnut. See, I got the doctor in that time. Hi, Beatrice.
Hi.
I always forget to say the doctor part. I always add it in later, weirdly and awkwardly. But yeah, so Beatrice is a Enneagram expert. She's an author of currently 2 books. The Complete Enneagram was her first book, and then her second book was 9 Types of Leadership, which also talks about the Enneagram, personal growth, and using it in leadership. And we have Beatrice back today. We've been talking through this short series of the 9 Enneagram types and the myths and misconceptions that sometimes get applied to all these types. You know, you might be online, you might be studying about the Enneagram, reading materials, seeing people talk about this in forums or discussion on Facebook or social media. And we want to highlight those myths and stereotypes because there's some nuggets of truth to these myths, right, around these generalizations. But there's so much more nuance in the system. And Beatrice's approach around the 27 subtypes, taking the Enneagram system and breaking it down into what's called instincts, mixing it, making 27 subtypes, it's just got incredible fidelity. And the most important thing is we believe it's one of the best ways to look at the Enneagram and grow as a person. Apply it to your personal growth journey. So we've been talking about these and we've been unpacking them. We've already talked about the body types, 8, 9, and 1. We've talked about the heart types, which are 2, 3, and 4. And today, we want to talk about the head types, 5, 6, and 7. So what do we mean by head type? Let's start there.
So the 3 head types, 5, 6, and 7, are the types that overuse or live more from the head center than they do from the other 2 centers, the heart center or the body-based center. Also, the head types are types that are associated with the core emotion of fear. And so each of the head types can be seen as having developed out of a response to early fear. Oftentimes in their experience, it remains unconscious, but to some degree, these types are connected to an experience of fear and an effort to find safety in some way or another.
Sure. And we have framed out this kind of like overdone aspect of fear, or when we did anger and sadness, you know, for the other 2 kind of core emotions. But this fear, there's like an overdone, kind of a medium level, and an underdone. How does that play out here?
Right. So 6s overdo the core emotion of fear. 7s underdo it. Most 7s will say they're not really afraid. They don't really they don't relate to that experience that much. And 5s are kind of in the middle. 5s kind of get good at avoiding situations in which their fear would come up. Now, an interesting thing to note about the 3 head types is they each have a fear that's a little bit targeted in a different direction. So 6s are afraid of being, 5s are afraid of feeling, and 7s are afraid of suffering.
Gotcha. Let's by the way, that's great. Let's go over to 5, start there. What is a misconception or generalization or a myth that 5 might have applied to it?
So 5s often get stereotyped as being aloof, at not being in touch with their emotions at all. It's a little bit like what we talked about with the 3s, but very different than 3s. 5s are not emotional types. And one of their main defensive strategies, unconscious defensive strategies, is automatically detaching from emotion. So they often live more in their mental activity, and they may think about feelings rather than actually feeling feelings. So they don't really live in their feelings. However, it doesn't mean they're completely unemotional robots. Sometimes people get the sense that 5s are completely insensitive and not capable of empathy and really not in touch with emotions at all. However, most 5s will tell you they do have feelings and they are in touch with their feelings. They tend to feel more comfortable feeling them when they're by themselves. It's much harder for them to be in contact with their emotions in the moment with the person that's right in front of them that they're feeling the feeling about. But especially when they're by themselves, they can really feel a lot of feelings. And of course, their growth path also is about getting into more and more in touch with their feelings.
Your business partner, Aranio, is an Enneagram 5, right?
Yes, he's a 5, and he's a social 5. So one of the myths about 5s being that they tend to be very quiet, not very expressive, is also something that I think, knowing Uranio, brings that to my attention, because he, being a social 5, he's a little bit more out there with the social instinct as part of his makeup. He actually is very good on stage and can be very expressive in front of a group of people. And so people, when we used to work on a board of directors together, a lot of people would come up to me and say, he's not a 5, is he? He's a 3. And knowing him really well, I would say, no, he really is a 5. It's just that you may have too narrow a definition of what a 5 is, and that they can't be emotional or they can't be really expressive.
So that sort of ivory tower perspective of a 5, I always think of some sort of like wizard in an ivory tower poring over books and never coming down and talking to the common man.
Right.
That's the myth. The myth is the complete aloof and separated from others.
Right, exactly. That they're always quiet, they're always shy, they aren't capable of getting in touch with feelings and relating to people from an emotional place, which I think 5s often do feel emotional. And I think especially I think the biggest way the myth gets expressed is that they think 5s are insensitive. In other words, they're not sensitive to other people. But what's really true about 5s is that they're extremely sensitive, which is part of the reason why they need more boundaries and they need more privacy, and they may need to retreat to experience their feelings, is because they're very, very sensitive. Ronnie and I do this thing when we do one of our workshops, where we actually act out what the 5 sensitivity looks like, where we stand together and he narrates what it feels like to him, to me, to be in front of him. And even if I look in his direction or take a step toward him, it has a big impact on him. And so if he's narrating the sensitivity of what it feels like, and if I take a step away, how it feels, he really feels that. So the thing about 5s is that they're very, very sensitive, and that a lot of times people, when they assume this kind of insensitivity, they really, first of all, don't understand 5s at all, and they can really thwart their ability to develop a good relationship with a 5 because they're not really valuing the ways 5s may reach out to us.
Yeah, this makes me think, in the Myers-Briggs system of the INTJ personality type, I wrote an article about how they're actually just filled with nougat. It's like they have a hard candy shell, but they're filled with nougat, this sort of squishy center. And I got a lot of responses from people of that personality type going, yeah, this is like one of the first times I've ever seen somebody address that inner sensitivity. And when I was talking about this type, and actually I think there's a lot of crossover between the INTJ type and type 5. Not that you have to be a type 5 if you're an INTJ and vice versa, but I do think that there's a trend of crossover. And what I noticed is that when people of this type, right, whichever type you're talking about, when they get feedback that that they're this mastermind, or like this insensitive, cold, robotic mastermind, and when they integrate that, then they shut others out, and then that prevents them from really going out into the world and making the impact they could make. And so they tend to withdraw. The more they integrate this myth, the more withdrawn they become, because they don't want to expose that they actually are sensitive. Is it very similar with type 5s?
Yes. Well, if you're a very, very sensitive person, but you get misperceived as being kind of cold and aloof and insensitive, that's a recipe for shutting down, right? So a 5's not going to open up more to you if you're treating them like they're an insensitive robot and you have no emotions. And so it's really important for us to understand that, you can't judge a book by its cover. Like, someone may seem shy, but that they're actually more available than they seem, especially if you are open-minded and understand how they really are, as opposed to how they might be easily stereotyped.
This is a side note, just for my own curiosity. Have you noticed that there are more type 5s interested in the Enneagram in general? Like, are they clustered as like interested parties in the Enneagram system in general?
I wouldn't necessarily say there's more 5s interested in it, but I would say that 5s, when they really understand what the Enneagram system is, they do get very easily interested in it.
Gotcha. Because it's that learning piece, that wanting to understand information and really study up on something they're interested in.
Right. And being easily fascinated by systems of knowledge that explain a lot of things and are a big source of learning.
So then back to the growth principle, each of these myths, I've been taking, you probably saw the pattern, you the listener, I've been taking it in this sort of angle of how would the stereotype of myth, if you're a person who has a type 5 in your life, or if you are a type 5, if you're perpetuating it or if you're integrating it, what's the type, I'm sorry, can you remind me what type 5's growth leverage point for growth is, and how this stereotype might actually be counterintuitive to the growth?
Right. So 5s, again, automatically detach from emotion and go into the comfort zone of mental activity, as part of the automatic pattern of the personality. But when 5s seek to grow, it's about learning to get more in touch with their emotions more often, and then learning to share their emotions more with others, in the moment. And so if you're misunderstanding the 5 and they're very sensitive, again, they're going to close down instead of open up both inside themselves to their own emotions, and especially in terms of sharing what they're feeling with you.
So giving credit for when they're sharing feelings and when they're being more vulnerable, and yeah.
Yes. The story I like to tell, which I think sums it up perfectly, is one time I heard a 5 on an Enneagram type panel describe his relationship with his ex-wife. And he said, if emotions were money, she was a 4 and she would have been a millionaire and he would have had a few pennies. And she always wanted him to show more emotion. And he would give her like 12 of his 18 pennies. And for him, that was a lot. And for her, it was nothing. So I think sometimes we need to recognize that one of the things that personality types tell us about the differences between us is that we can't judge other people based on our own filters and our own experience. And so especially with 5s, if you have a different relationship to your emotions, you need to make room for the fact that this is a person who has a very different internal experience.
All right, we're moving on to the type I've been waiting for this entire series now. My type 6. I want to hear about myths and misconceptions around Enneagram 6s.
Okay, I think with 6s, oftentimes people see them as overly pessimistic or negative because 6s tend to be good at forecasting potential problems before they happen, right?
Did you hear this, personality hacker team? Everybody tells me this. Did you guys hear this? I want you to pay attention to this.
Yeah, so people can say, you're so negative, you're so pessimistic, you're always poking holes in things, you're always trying to look for the problem. And because 6s are good problem solvers, they can tend to be problem seekers. But what 6s will say is they don't think of themselves as pessimistic at all. They think of themselves as realistic, as just seeing what's really there and being alert to the problems that could occur so you can prepare for them ahead of time and make contingency plans and be smart about what could happen so that you're ready to handle it when it does happen.
Preach it, sister. This is amazing. Yes. Absolutely. It's to try to get ahead of the problems. I'm not being pessimistic. It's
right.
From my standpoint, I have other people on my radar and I want to predict as best to our ability what could potentially be 6 months down the road, in the business, let's say a cash flow crisis,
right,
and get ahead of it so that we don't all suffer, 6 months from now.
Right.
That's my intent.
Yeah. You could see it as smart planning or being a good troubleshooter. These are gifts and qualities that we need to see in 6s because they are real strengths. But again, because 6s from other people's point of view can seem to dwell too much on what could go wrong, we can tend to see them in more of a negative light than I think is actually good for any of us.
So I'm definitely guilty of this, of seeing, because Joel and I will have a conversation and he'll start trying to troubleshoot a problem that I don't really feel exists yet or might not ever exist. and I'll offer some ideas or, solutions, and they're not enough, right? Or they're not said exactly the way they need to be said. And so I do like get this perspective that he's just being really pessimistic or cynical or maybe even dismissive of me. And so we've worked out some communication strategies that help this, but what happens, like, what is the point of growth for sixes? Like, what's the leverage point? And with somebody who's in a relationship with the six, like I am, what happens if I project the cynicism onto him? Like, how does that throw the path of growth off?
Well, I think it's good for sixes to acknowledge their fear or acknowledge their patterns of thinking about what could go wrong, but not to see that as necessarily a bad thing. Now, of course, it can be a bad thing if you overdo it and you don't understand it and don't understand what motivates it and what actually is good about it. So I think sixes, we should never, ever try to talk sixes out of their fears and concerns. First of all, it just won't work. And second of all, it makes the six feel like you really don't understand. And so the first thing is it can be important to just accept what their patterns are as strengths, but also help them understand how their fears can be overdone or how their fears can actually stop them. So the high side of six is courage, and courage doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means feeling the fear and moving forward anyway. So if we want to help the sixes in our lives own their fears, acknowledge them, understand the good information that sometimes their fears bring, but also help them move forward and take action despite being fearful, will accept what's going on and not somehow pathologize it as being too negative or too pessimistic.
So then in a situation like that, and I'm asking as somebody in a relationship, I know Joel has plenty to say here. I just want to make sure that I get the right message.
Right.
Basically, if the message from me to a six is, what's the problem? Like, chill out. You're being way too pessimistic. Like, that might not even happen anyway. All that message does is it invalidates the fear. And so there's going to be a tendency, if I'm hearing correctly, to almost double down on it.
Sure.
And so then it doesn't allow the six to zoom out, because they're going to, it's almost like a dog with a bone. They're going to stick with it until they feel understood.
Right.
But if I'm less invalidating and I acknowledge, okay, so I understand why this could be a fear, I understand why you might be feeling this way, then as opposed to needing the reinforcement, or I'm giving them validation and reinforcement. And so then they're far more likely to let go and then be willing to zoom out and maybe see a bigger picture. Am I hearing that right?
Definitely. Well, even before letting it go, I think it's important for us to acknowledge the wisdom that they bring, right? To listen to hear out their fears.
You can be here on the show anytime. Beatrice.
You need to hear them out, because you may think, especially as a 3, like, okay, you're just wasting time with talking about this thing that might not happen. He may be putting his finger on something that could happen, or that at least it might be good to slow down a little bit and consider what happens if, right? So there is something important about being able to allow space for the fears and concerns. Of course, like with any type, the issue comes in when they overdo it. So he may need you to sort of take a pause, hear him out fully, recognize, wow, you know what, you may have a point, or thank you for bringing this to my attention because I wouldn't have thought of it. And that could happen. And if we think about that ahead of time, that won't undermine us. But then also help him when he may be focusing on it excessively to say, okay, I think we've really taken advantage of the wisdom that, your point of view is bringing. And I think we may be dwelling on this too much and we may need to move on.
I think that's really, that's a good perspective shift.
Yeah, from my standpoint, two things that have this specifically, and we can move on after this and get to the other type, but two things. One, I've learned that, well, first of all, the dynamic would happen when I would say fears that are coming down the road. And if I wasn't heard, it wasn't like, oh, I'll just let that fear. Okay, that must just be an unfounded fear. I interpret that as I'm not communicating this severely enough.
Right.
And so what would happen is, and I'm a feeler in the Myers-Briggs system, so then I would anchor in more emotion. I need to get more passionate about this. Two people on our team are threes, and I'm like, well, they're just not. I got to get passionate about this, and they need to understand the importance. And so I'll amp up and I'll dwell and focus. And then the more passionate I get, the more even dismissive people are, because they're like, wow, okay, you're just really emotional about this.
Right.
I'm dismissing the emotion. And then the more dismissive it is, the more maybe I have to get even more passionate. So I'm accelerating the passion behind the trying to communicate this.
Right. Or the alarm, the sense of alarm. Like I'm highlighting a potential emergency and they're not hearing me. So I need to even be more expressive. And so you're doing a great job of describing what can be a difficult dynamic if we don't understand the 6 perspective and give it space.
Exactly. And so I've learned that if I'm being dismissed early on, don't try to accelerate emotion, because that doesn't really help add to the conversation. And the second thing is, I don't share as many of the little nitpicky thoughts and fears of what might be coming down the pike. I'm not looking at every single, and I'm learning to pick my battles better by bringing, sit with them and think through, okay, will this actually be the threshold of what I bring to the table? I'm getting better at over time, which probably is also the pathway for 6.
Right. Yeah. A lot of fears could come up in the course of, say, planning a project, but can you get better at sort of seeing which ones rise to a certain level where it would be of value to discuss it and bring it to other people's attention?
And based on experience, what's the likelihood of this actually happening? And the more experience I have, the better that gets too.
Exactly. And you have more ability to soothe your fear when it's sort of at a low level, but also recognize that when your fear is at a higher level, that it's good to speak about it.
Before we move on to 7, I just want to bring attention. We talk a lot. I mean, all the types are relevant. We zoomed in a lot on 4, and sometimes you do talk a lot about 6s as well, because we're weirdos. We've kind of got this weird, I don't know, almost a push-pull relationship with a lot of things, right? We're kind of this bizarre type that can cause a lot of trouble for everybody. And maybe you just want to speak to that just briefly, if you could.
I wouldn't say that 6s are any more weirdos than any other type, really. But I do think sometimes they can feel a sense of that. I do think that 6s are complex. And sometimes when I'm doing a typing interview and I'm asking questions like, do you do this? What's your experience of this? 6s will often say, it depends. As an answer to every question, because there's a way that they can see things as being really context dependent. And another thing that's interesting about 6s is the 3 subtypes of 6 are really different from each other, to the point where it's almost hard to talk about one kind of 6 because they are so even opposite in certain ways from each other. And so I think that makes 6 a complicated type, but I wouldn't necessarily say any worse or weirder than any other type.
Maybe that's what I meant, more complex. And I guess that's the thing, is if you're trying to overgeneralize 6 in any way,
yes,
you're probably talking about one of the subtypes, and you're really not hitting the other 2, most likely.
Right. And another thing to remember about 6s is sometimes 6s will say before they learned the Enneagram, they didn't think of themselves as fearful. So from inside a 6, what we might name as fear, when we know the Enneagram or when we see it in a certain way, a 6 will often say, well, I didn't really think of myself as fearful. I just always thought of myself as being really good at being prepared.
Vigilant.
Yeah. Or just being smart about the realities of what could happen. And so it's almost, for some of the subtypes, it's good to be able to understand that this is rooted in fear, because they may not identify that as such when they're just living their life.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. Cool. Thank you for that. All right, let's move over to 7. What is a misconception, overgeneralization, or myth about type 7?
So 7s tend to they're really good at looking at the bright side, at focusing on the positive, at being very optimistic. I think sometimes 7s get stereotyped as being overly superficial or shallow, or being really non-committal, like not being able to commit to things. Now, certainly that can be an issue for 7s, but for instance, here's a good example of it. A lot of people, when I'm teaching the Enneagram, ask me, do you find that 7s don't get in long-term relationships very much? And every time someone asks me that, I think of the sevens I know, and most of the sevens I know have been in long-term relationships. So I think there's a way that sevens get a bad rap around being too lightweight, too shallow, not being serious, and not being able to make a commitment to a relationship. Now, certainly there's a reason for that, for some of the misconceptions, in that sevens can be perceived as lightweight when they maybe don't want to sink into something more deeply. Then they tend to skim along the surface when they want to look at things in terms of what's going well, and it's harder for them to look at the negative data or have that difficult conversation that sometimes we need to have with each other. But I don't think that means they don't have the capacity for greater depth or being more in touch with things that are on the more serious side.
Yeah, I think about the sevens I know in my life. Like my brother, I'm fairly certain is a I think we were talking about probably self-pres 7. And he's been married to my sister-in-law for decades and would never even dream about ever, any infidelity is just disturbing to him. In fact, he wouldn't even watch the show Mad Men because of the infidelity of the characters. It was so disturbing to him. And I was thinking about another set of friends of mine where one of them was a 7 and the other one was a self-pres 2. And the self-pres 2 didn't want to commit, and the 7 did.
Yeah, I can see that, being a self-pres 2 myself.
Yeah, and so it's kind of interesting that they would get... I could see the reputation of being more shallow, but I find it interesting, the reputation or the stereotype of not wanting to commit. But I guess people kind of conflate those two things a little bit. But I think that 7 piece is probably more about the fun-loving and always looking for the next part, the stereotype of looking for the next party.
Right. And certainly they are pleasure-loving, and certainly a lot of them like to have fun and like to keep the mood up. I think those things are true. But I think, again, like anything, we take it a little bit too far when we see them as overly lightweight or not capable of being serious. I just think that's not true. And a lot of sevens, I think, feel really hurt by that in a way that they don't often show. I also think another thing that we often don't know about sevens is they're much more self-critical than they look, because they tend to have such a happy exterior. Sometimes we don't notice, or they don't show us when like something we say really hurts them, or they feel criticized, or they beat themselves up on the inside. I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand about sevens. That's really important to know, so that we don't inadvertently make them feel criticized or bad in a way that's really unfair.
Yeah, my brother's a showrunner at this point. He's both a science fiction writer and he's also a showrunner. And the second, we got an opportunity to go watch his show be produced in Toronto recently, and he is so serious at his job. He's barking orders and he's taking leadership, and he is not kidding around. And I think as a science fiction writer too, he's shown great depth. He's shown the ability to sit and think with things, think about things deeply and world build. And I think that would be a surprise that he would be a 7 and not say like a 5 or some other stereotype around, say, a science fiction writer.
Right.
But as a 7, he's very serious about his craft, which is why he's so good at it.
Right. Another example I might offer is I work with a sexual 7, and sexual 7s self-preservation 7s are practical 7s. Sexual 7s tend to be a little bit more idealistic, a little bit more living life from their imagination as opposed to reality. But I work with a sexual 7, and I think because she has that tendency, she's learned to be quite serious. And it's actually really easy to work with her when we're doing business together, because she's very detail oriented. She's really on top of things. It's like she's really developed her ability to engage more deeply with whatever needs to happen, because she knows she can have this sensitivity to things being too serious or too hard or not fun. And so I think, again, in that instance, it's like if we don't give our 7 friends room to grow and expand, it's almost like we keep them limited in the box that we put them in, instead of allowing them to be healthy 7s and to be able to develop a lot more capacity to be serious and more thorough in the things that they do.
So you just said it, but I just want to stay consistent with how we've approached all the types, because we've sort of pointed out the path of growth for each type, and how integrating this message or giving this message to somebody of that type in your life can be counterintuitive to their growth. So, I mean, you just did a beautiful job of describing it, but I just want to point out again that the path of growth for a 7 is getting deeper. Is that accurate?
Right. I mean, 7s have a sensitivity to having their freedom be limited from the outside, to having their options be limited. And so, again, I think they need to recognize that that's the case, but also develop, say, more self-discipline, more ability. They tend to be really good at the idea stage of a project, good visionaries, but have more trouble sticking to it when it comes to implementation. So more ability to tolerate what might be more tedious or boring or not sort of the fun stuff. I think that's the path of growth for them. One way to see this is the 7 going to 1, because I think 1s can be really good at bringing ideals into reality, and 7s need to learn to do that more, and they're fully capable of it when they're healthy and doing their work.
And so the message that they are shallow, if a person were to integrate it as a 7 and go, oh, well, I'm just shallow, or if we were to project that onto 7s, then how would that derail them from their growth?
I think sometimes when we apply these myths and we communicate to people from a stereotypic place, what it does is it shuts them down to us. In other words, it keeps them from engaging in deeper relationship with us. And often it's through relationships and understanding each other that we really grow. But if you're treating someone as if they're shallow, when they have the capacity to be much deeper, they may just only go so far with us in relationship, and we don't get to have the advantage of growing together and supporting them in their growth. And so it's important, again, always to leave room for, okay, this may be the personality pattern, but it doesn't completely define this person.
So just to make a corollary with Myers-Briggs, I was hanging out with somebody who's an ESFP, and I could tell, I mean, it was a new friend, right? It was somebody I had just been introduced to, and we had hung out a little bit, and I could tell within the first 15 minutes, this person's probably an ESFP. And as we were talking, I said, and they were behaving in a way that appeared to be, more energy than conversation, and some of the stereotypes that people have around ESFPs. And I said, one of the things that people might not realize about you, because she said, tell me stuff about my type, because she had a very surface awareness of Myers-Briggs. And I said, well, one of the things that people might not know about you, and you might actually hide from them, is how deep you actually really are. That you are, that you have a lot of depth, and you probably think about things very seriously. And that's not necessarily that's not your front face, but that's a big piece of who you are. And so since you don't always feel permission to bring it out to others, then you probably end up having these relationships where you feel like you have to perform for them, and they never get to see that side of you because you don't feel a lot of permission showing it. And I remember her just looking at me stunned. Like how could you possibly know that? Mm-hmm. And that she was just like, her jaw dropped. And I imagine, again, there's probably some trend here. Not that all ESFPs would be, say, 7s in Enneagram or vice versa, because my brother's an ENTJ and he's a 7. But there's probably some, a little bit of at least crossover in behavior. And so is that kind of a similar thing with 7s? It's like when you acknowledge that they have the deeper side, suddenly they feel like you're almost seeing into them.
Yes, I think it's really true. And I also think, for instance, like we talked about 4s in the last podcast, where people say 4s can't be happy. If you're happy, you can't be a 4. It's a similar thing with a 7. Like sometimes just life happens to 7s, and they go through a period of, say, depression, or they go through something difficult and they get in touch with deeper feelings. It's almost like people think, well, they're not a 7. So we have to make room for the fact that when 7s get in touch with some of these deeper feelings, it really is an important path for them, and we need to allow for space, even in the way we think about them and the way we relate to them, for the reality that they have a lot of capacity for deeper feelings. Sometimes in personality or when under stress, they may not always access that, but we don't want to limit them in terms of how we view them or how we talk to them or how we treat them, because it's just not the case that they are only capable of a certain level of feeling.
Well, and humans are humans, right? Like,
Right.
We get fascinated by personality models because they're access points to helping us understand other people.
Right.
And they give us language for behaviors and trends and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, we're all just human beings with a wider range of human emotions and capacities and desires and instincts and so one of the things that I think stereotypes and myths do, we've talked about it in the previous podcast, sometimes they're access points to understanding a model or a system. And sometimes they're access points for us to get going on our journey of using tools like this for growth. But at the end of the day, the map is not the territory, as we like to say from Alfred Krasipsky, which is that like these aren't actually describing the human being. Like this is a way to understand elements of them and they're helpful for growth and for observing what we're doing, and that we know there's patterns in people, but to say a 7 can't be sad or a 4 can't be happy is actually dehumanizing.
Right.
We're not acknowledging that they're human first.
Right. And that they're actually much more than just their personality type.
This has been great. And just like we mentioned on each of these episodes, these stereotypes or myths might be good access points for you if you're maybe new to the system to start. But really, there's a whole wealth of, and there's some truth to some of these, but there's a whole wealth of knowledge once you start to understand the 27 subtypes. And I just want to again highlight a program that Beatrice has created here with us here at Personality Hacker. We published it here called the Enneagram Roadmap, which goes into all of those 27 subtypes and the differences and all the nuance, and then growth paths. We talk about the growth path there. It's a course designed for personal growth. And I believe, and one of the reasons why we love working with Beatrice so much is we all have a similar philosophy in all these typology systems we talk about. We don't want to talk about them just for their own sake. I mean, we kind of like it. We could probably do it all day because we enjoy them. But the thing that we've seen is just personal growth in our own lives, applying these principles and some of the ways of seeing ourselves and the growth that we've been able to do with these different models. It is powerful. And in your life, if you look at these models and you use them for growth, we believe that's a great starting point in your personal growth journey and a continuation point too. It doesn't really matter where you are in your journey. We believe your relationship to these models can give you maps and access to things that would be maybe years of work to find otherwise. They're just really good ways to zoom in and start working on yourself. So I would recommend that if you want to go deeper down this, the Enneagram Roadmap is something you might want to check out. Also, you absolutely have to have Beatrice's 2 books on your bookshelf. You're not a complete person without them, really, if you think about it. You have to have both of these as reference materials on your bookshelf, and they've got a wealth of knowledge in those too. So go get the complete Enneagram and also pick up the 9 types of leadership and have those in your collection, because you're going to want to come back to those over and over again as you grow in yourself. And then we're going to continue to work with Beatrice and also her business partner, Uranio. We're going to see if we can continue to develop Enneagram and Myers-Briggs. We're calling them mashup content because we don't really know if there's a direct way to marry both systems. But we do believe that if we, almost like musicians that get on the stage to play together, there's going to be interesting music, a jazz performance that comes from us continuing to having conversations, taking questions from you, and you're listening. You might have questions that help us further working with these 2 systems and the crossovers of growth that can happen from them. I'm really excited about some of the opportunities that are going to come down the lane and working more with Beatrice and her business partner as well. So be watching out for more and more of that as we continue to develop our relationship with Beatrice. Beatrice, thanks again for being here this week on the show. Again, if somebody wants to find more about you, what's your website?
BeatriceChestnut.com.
Okay. And you have, probably not total, there's probably a limit to how many typing sessions and things you can do, but you also do personal coaching. You host live events all over the world around the Enneagram.
Right. Uranio Pius and I host retreats and workshops all over the world. And we're also coming out with a new Enneagram Academy. We're doing an official launch of our new website sometime in the next month, CP Enneagram Academy.
Fantastic. And then, keep in touch with what Beatrice is doing, and you're going to be hearing more from her here at Personality Hacker as we continue.
Yeah. Is there any final little nuggets that you want to leave, or do you feel completely
I guess I just want to say how great it is to be in conversation with you both and to be exploring this territory that I think we both feel so passionate about. And I really look forward to more discussions, especially in terms of what the overlaps are and the connections are between the Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram system.
Fantastic. If you have a question, a comment, you haven't been able to speak into a microphone with the three of us, but now is your chance to come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below the show, you can leave a comment, ask a question, or share your story. We want to hear your story because we think stories are really good ways to grow and share with what's going on with us. And it's a good opportunity for us to have conversations at personalityhacker.com. So that's the best place to do that.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot. Once again, I want to plug Beatrice's books, The Complete Enneagram and 9 Types of Leadership. Both are fantastic books that they belong in your bookshelf. And if you're in a book buying mood, you could add the Personality Hacker book to that too. I don't believe that you're not a complete person without the book, but I think maybe you might be a happier person with the book.
That's right. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.